Hey guys, it's Tomatoda. Today's video is going to be a review for Padico's Mermaid Puffy air dry clay. I won't be going over its usage with molds because there's already a good blog covering that part made by Pink Panda Craft Shop. So this is the front of the packaging and this is the back side of the packaging. As you can see, it's all in Japanese and I have no idea what it says. But thanks to Google, I found some good info about what it probably says on a website called Modes for You. It had two pretty crucial information on it right here. As you can see, I've already opened the clay because I was impatient and I really wanted to play with it. But it's been wrapped up for 5 days and it's still nice and fresh. This is what the inside looks like. When I want to use a portion of the clay, I use the backside of my blade, or you can probably use a plastic card as well, and separate the clay from the outside of the packaging by pressing down. That way, I can easily pull out the section I want to use without contaminating the rest of the block and exposing it to only a little bit of air. Then I roll it back up, making sure there's no air inside and seal it with tape. Then I put it into a sandwich baggie while trying to squeeze out as much air as possible, seal it shut, and put it away. Now time to put it through some tests. The clay is very lightweight, soft, and easily malleable, and I think the work time is okay. It doesn't dry out super fast, but for someone who is slow like me, you will have to rush a little bit. The clay does stretch a bit before it rips apart, as you can see here. Adding a small amount of water helps to revive it if it starts to dry out, but don't add too much. Pasta machine test on a thicker setting. Beautiful. Pasta machine test on a thinner setting. I'm just happy that it does come out and at least it doesn't get stuck everywhere. I know this sheet looks dirty, but that's because my pasta machine was dirty, so I'm sorry. Cut test with scissors, very good. Cut test with blade, it's okay. Stamping, very good. Cookie cutters, pretty good too. It does get stuck inside a cutter sometimes, so if you want to use that piece, you'll have to be careful when taking it out or you're going to leave marks. The sharper the cutter, the smoother the cut. My clay magically turned pink here, but this is footage I filmed later because I forgot to add it before. If the clay has some cracks here and there, you can smooth it out with water on your fingertips. When I added two separate blobs together, they pulled apart easily. Even after they were fully dried, I was still able to pull them apart easily, so keep that in consideration when crafting. Anyways, I'm going to set aside this white clay in a baggie for now, making sure there's as little air in there as possible. Now I'm going to do some tests on these random pieces that have been drying for 5 days. Remember, when they're dried, they're supposed to be waterproof. It has a soft bounce to it. It's not rock hard, but it keeps its shape. The thicker flat pieces here are pretty tough and I can't rip them apart with my hands, but the thinner flat pieces are actually easily rippable. Cut test with scissors, pretty good. Even on this thick piece. Look at the texture inside. Stamp test? No, of course, but the indentation marks don't bounce back, it just stays indented. As for the coloring portion, I'll be crafting a fake pumpkin clock while testing out a few different coloring methods. First, I'm using color pastels. Pros and cons. Pro, it's very clean and won't make a mess. Cons, not very pigmented. It could depend on the chalk, but it requires a lot of powder from my experience. I ended up adding the same amount of pigments about 4 times total to get a near desired saturation. I'm going to set this orange disc aside so that the surface dries enough for me to paint on it without mushing it. Next is acrylic paint. Pros and cons. Pro, it's very pigmented. Con, a little bit messy because the extra moisture makes it sticky, and also just the paint itself does get everywhere, but after kneading it for a while, it turns normal, and to be honest, it's not as messy as I had expected it to be. I would say it's reasonable. However, when I tested clay with alcohol ink a few days ago, it was crazy messy. I tried it with bare hands and gloves, and it was chaos both times. I don't recommend alcohol ink if possible. Anyways, I'm gonna save this purple in a bag so I can go clean my hands and work surface. The clay washes off really well with water, and as you can see, it wipes off easily. I'm going to bring back my orange disc and use acrylic paint to paint on the surface. The acrylic paint doesn't really absorb into the clay, it more like sits on top of the surface, and it does create texture and shine if used in a thicker amount. Next, I'm going to use Posca paint markers to draw the rest of the details. Posca markers turned out to be my favorite method of drawing on the Padico clay. Super easy and clean. Just make sure your Posca marker isn't too leaky like this green marker is. Because this orange clay has only been dried for about 15 minutes, I'm going to use a light hand in order to not dent it. Then I'm going to use pastel chalk to powder its cheeks. As you can see, it applies very smoothly without any clumping. Bringing back the purple again, I'm going to cut out a frame for the pumpkin, and because the orange pumpkin has dried a bit, when I layered the purple frame on top, I added some water on the edges of the pumpkin, hoping that they would stick together better, which they do, but to a certain extent. Here, I took a clear plastic sheet to create an imitation glass cover. One thing that always appealed to me about air dry clay is the fact that you can incorporate plastic into it, because with polymer clay, you have to bake it to cure it, and well, that would obviously melt the plastic. But no worries with air dry clay. Then I'm gonna draw the hands. It's 11:45 for no particular reason. And here, I'm adding another frame on top to hold the plastic covering in place. The sides look a bit ugly, so I thought I'd cover it up, but I didn't realize it would be hard to blend in this part without smushing the whole thing, so I just left it as is. I cut the excess on the back and let it dry for about 2 days before continuing with the rest of the decorative parts. One thing I really liked is that once the clay was fully dried, the Posca markers and the acrylic paint didn't rub off. Like you'd actually have to forcefully scratch into the clay itself to remove the paint. I applied both Posca markers and acrylic paint before the clay was fully dried and after it was fully dried. The results were the same. They colored the same way and it didn't budge at all. Here, I pressed some extra details into the clay before it dried, and then glued it with Gorilla Gel Glue after it was dry. This little rhinestone here was surprisingly stuck on very well. It took me a bit of work to pull it off, and it wasn't actually the rhinestone that popped off, but the clay had ripped off. Still, I was impressed at how well they had adhered together. The polymer clay canes, on the other hand, as I expected, it's difficult to get polymer clay to stick to anything sometimes, even with powerful glue and prepping. So if you want to add any polymer clay canes, make sure to give it a coat of something. I coated mine with UV resin, and now it's rock hard, like Dwayne Johnson's abs. Another thing is, I glued this hair tie backing to this chunky taiyaki with the same glue, and it stuck on really well. I didn't even clean or prep the surfaces, I just glued it to see what would happen, and wow, it stuck for sure. I'd have to use it long term just in case, but for the moment, it's very impressive. Back to the pumpkin clock. It's been drying for 5 days now. On day 2, I glued the extra bling blings and wrote Boo O'Clock, cause Halloween is a time to scare some bitches. As you can see, everything has hardened and is securely attached. However, in the end, it is just air dry clay, so yes, it is easily destroyable with enough force. With the leftover clay, I made this shitty Kirby Trinket Tray and these marshmallows. Even after it's dried, you can still poke a hole and make it into some charms or earrings. It's pretty fun, and the texture is pretty cool. Now we are at the last part of this review, which is about UV resin. I made 2 of these kawanashis to see if there would be any color changes when UV resin is applied, and as you can see, there's absolutely no color change. The UV resin did, however, fill in the side cracks, or it made them look more shallow at least, like he got Botox injections. Anyways, that concludes my review. I did enjoy Padico's clay a lot better than the Daiso air dry clay. I love how easy it is to draw on the clay and the fact that I don't have to do any extra steps to protect the paint job. But unless what you make is one big chunky blob, gentle use is definitely recommended for your completed pieces. Like, it won't fall apart by itself, but if you are a little bit irresponsible with your belongings like I am and it snags on something, I do foresee damage. And that's it. Thanks for watching. See ya!